Welcome to LARP Academia, and today we're going to talk about LARP disasters so that we can learn from them and not repeat them. Now, why do I come in with that statement, and why am I even covering LARP disasters? The tabletop industry has not had that many schisms and scandals. Instead, they've had differences of opinions on how to play their games. For example, D&D wants to play fantasy, Force and Destiny, Star Wars wants to play on a more space, Star Warsy type of experience. And if you're looking for a more generic version of that, there's also Traveler and GURPS and these binders, and there's even more out there. Industries can have differences. They've changed. They make it so that they're able to split off and, well, start in different directions rather than having D&D start and then eventually it became Force and Destiny after this huge scandal. But eventually there was another schism from D&D that created GURPS and also Traveler, and it's not usually like that. It's more of a, we have a difference in idea on how themes should be done and how we should make these tabletop games, so they made a different one. You would think it's that way in LARPing, and it sometimes is, but oftentimes there's a lot of schisms, and there's a lot of disasters which cause new LARPs to form, which, in all honesty, is really hurting LARPs from becoming these big nationwide things and actually affecting the world and our country like other hobbies would. For example, think of it this way. If there are 7 different LARPs that have 3 parks, okay, or 3 chapters, whatever, in different areas, they're going to be small, localized, and, fun for the community, but not too big overall of an impact on our culture in the U.S., since I'm in the U.S., but this could also apply to other countries. Now imagine if those separate LARP chapters and groups were brought into one where they have 21 chapters or groups all across the country. They're a unified system. They're expanding it across, and then there's less of confusion, and the LARP grows. The LARP gets bigger. People start to realize, like, oh, this is what LARPing is. And they're able to go from one side of the country to do what they were doing there. And if they have to move to the other side, they can still play the same game. Now, this also kind of explains to the normal person that there are different LARPs. Yes, just like there are different preferences in tabletop games. But it's explainable, understandable, and tangible to the normal person, more so, and that would actually help LARPing grow. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of schisms. And in order to understand this latest disaster, which is another schism, we have to look at Alliance's parent LARP to kind of understand what Alliance is, what happened, and something very, very important to the current state of the Alliance disaster that is happening. Now, Alliance came from Nero. Nero itself has had 6 schisms. Alliance is the 4th. And it's going to go through the 7th if it's not already going through it now. Yay. But that's really hurt Nero and not let this type of LARP flourish to what it could be. And you might be asking, well, what is Nero? Well, Nero came around in 1988, and it was formed by Ford Ivey. Now, the reason why I'm going into founders will become a little bit clearer as the time goes on. It's not always important to know who founded what LARP and everything else, but this time it really is. So Ford Ivey founded this LARP with the idea that, D&D is great and all, but what if we could do that in real life? Which, of course, only about 102% of LARPs did, give or take 2% around that time. And this LARP wanted to take a little bit further than what many LARPs do. This is where people get the idea of, oh, when you're LARPing, you have to completely put makeup on, have tusks, have like actual armor, and have your duct tape and latex weapons, which are not that good really when you compare it to higher tech foam weapons or better weapons nowadays. So that's where this idea of that type of LARP came from, is from Nero. It's an interesting concept, one that can be taken a little far and seen as too far by some people, but it's definitely a part of LARPing, especially for those who are very enthusiastic about the role play and the costuming and getting everything in there. It's an interesting way to LARP. However, there are some problems. We're going to skip ahead a little bit in time. We're not going to cover all the other issues and schisms that happened in Nero and why and everything else. We're going to skip ahead into the 90s, about mid-90s, early 90s, there was a person named Mike V, or Mike Valentra, who will become very important, as you'll soon see. Now, Mike Valentra had real-life things happen. He had whatever. Maybe he needed to make sure his finances are in order. We all get it. We all get where we have to sometimes step away from the hobby because real life interferes. And in doing so, he had to shut down his local chapter. If you're wondering what a chapter is, it's like a park, local branch, whatever, of the game of Nero. And, okay, we understand that. But later on, he wanted to, after some time, restart that branch. After all, he's got his life together now, and he's already gone through all the paperwork and everything that he needed to make this chapter an actual thing, so why not just restart it? Shouldn't be that big of an issue, right? Well, there was this other guy named Joe V, of course. V is kind of a weird addition to it, but Joe V had started a local chapter whose territory kind of overlapped with Mike's. Now, he and Mike clashed a lot. They clashed over rights to the area. They made it this giant political mess. And the founder, Ford Ivy, decided to take the side of Joe V. In fact, he went so far as to give Nero over to Joe V, which has caused a lot of fun things to happen. But he gave Nero over to Joe V. Now, there's a problem. Mike wanted to still play the game. He still liked the concept of Nero. He still liked trying to have all that extra makeup on, his characters that he's made, his friends in real life that have actually come to play the game and everything. He doesn't want to give that up. So he says, I'm going to make a split, and I'm going to make this Nero Alliance. Now, he's still using the name Nero, and there's some problems. Legal problems that ensue, and eventually he has to break off and form his own group, Alliance. Now, it pretty much has a lot of the same rules and everything else, but he broke off and founded Alliance. Now, this is where a lot of problems start already. When Mike broke off, Mike made it so that he was the sole owner of Alliance. Now, if you remember, the problem with Nero was with a clashing chapter owner and the owner of Nero itself. Now, this is something to keep in the forefront of your mind because it's going to become a big issue later on. Mike V essentially based the new LARP's legal system after the LARP that he just left. After all, he's using their same rule set. He's using pretty much everything that they are. He's just changing it a little bit, so he can play the game how he wants. And it doesn't seem too bad in the beginning. Fast forward a little bit. As time goes on, Mike V gets older. You're getting older. You're not as into the things you once were into. The hobby is a little bit off for him, and he starts to lose touch with the community, the game, and where everything else is going. And as he starts to lose touch, he thinks, maybe it's time I sell Alliance to someone else. And he starts to look into a buyer. Now, an important note. There was a person who was essentially the president of Alliance. They were the one who was the CEO, in charge of it, whatever else, however you want to phrase it. And the details are kind of muddy since there's a lot of private dealings because it was with the owners and the owners of each individual chapter and the overall owner of the Alliance brand. And they had someone else who was kind of forcing that brand forward, kind of like stockholders and a company. Now, this person, CEO of the company, was fired by the chapter owners because he did a terrible job. Matt W. has been cited to, reading pretty much a quote here from online, Matt Watkins was fired by the owners for gross incompetence. He repeatedly delayed votes and disregarded the owner's request to remain professional. At the time of his removal, multiple chapters tried to purchase Alliance from Mike V and Jess G, but all were turned aside. Now, this is a quote from someone on the forums who was posting about this, who was a chapter owner. And you get from this idea that chapter owners did not like Matt W. They did not like him at all, since he was terrible at everything, and they fired him. Makes sense. They even fired him with a vote of 7 other chapters. 7 out of 15. Now, this will become very important later because we'll kind of talk about it. They fired Matt W. earlier on in 2020. And the owners of Alliance, Mike V and Jess, decided that, when we wanted to sell that thing, let's sell it to someone that we know. Let's sell it to a good old friend. Let's sell it to Matt W. Now, Matt Watkins was, of course, fired by the people who own each individual chapters, and pretty much the owners of Alliance, the people who actually were using the Alliance brand, and that didn't go over very well with the chapter owners. In fact, how would you like to have someone who is supposed to represent your workplace, let's say that they're becoming the head of your union or whatever else you want to equate it with, let's say that you all decide to fire this person, a majority, we'll get into why 7 out of 15 is a majority later on, and then this person, after being fired and duly hated by pretty much everyone else, comes back and they own where you work. How would you like that? I'm assuming you wouldn't like that very much. And that is what is causing this huge split. The owners gave a complete disregard for their community. As they got older, they got out of touch, and they decided, we're just going to sell to our friend who was fired recently by the main people who run Alliance. And this caused a small split where some parks are leaving. Now, to give you an idea of what a small number of parks are, let me show you. Now, as you can see, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 official parks that are leaving, and 3 coming soon. So 3 potential parks or chapters, and 5 that are leaving Alliance. Now you might think, 5 parks with 3 potential, that's a small number, right? Well, remember how we said there were 7 out of 15 votes? Matt was trying to skew this and tell the community that it was only 7 out of 15, it wasn't majority, that's why their firing me was kind of invalid, it wasn't necessary. But something you should keep in mind. About 5 of those parks or 5 of those 15, have not actually played a game in 2 years. They have not played Alliance in 2 years. Now you might be thinking, wait, why are they still technically counted in this? And that's a little bit of the things you have to look into. Because these 5 parks are, once again, as we established with Nero and kind of earlier with Alliance a little bit, owned by individual owners. Each chapter is. So if you had gone through all this blood, sweat, tears, and hard work, and even paid money to get a hold of being the chapter owner, that title and everything, would you just give it up, or would you kind of hold on to it? Well, you might want to restart that park, so why not hold on to it? And that's kind of what's happening here. They are holding on to it, and they're being absentee, which makes it so that really 10 parks are in Alliance, or 10 chapters are really active Alliance chapters. And once again, if you remember how many chapters are leaving, 5 with 3 incoming chapters, that's not a small number of parks leaving. And it also kind of invalidates the other idea that, only 7 out of 15 voted for me, which wasn't even a majority. Well, if 5 haven't really played, that means that there are 10 that really count, and only 2 of them said no. That means 7 yes, 2 no. That's a vast majority when you're looking into it. And even when reading the forum replies from Matt W., where he's talking to people, a lot of his invalidations that I've stated before, the 7 out of 15, saying that only a small number of parks are leaving, it's all just throwing a small little... It really just tries to discredit other people and to make sure that their side can't be heard, even if it is extremely legitimate. So I do kind of understand, of course this isn't objective at this point, but from what I have read and from what I've seen, I do understand why the other chapters are leaving, and that from what they say of Matt W., it seems to actually hold a candle, unfortunately. And a lot of these owners did not want to wait and see where Alliance is going to go under Matt's new rule. Why would you want to wait and see where this goes if you just fired the guy and now he's supposed to lead you? I mean, what? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And that's where we're at in this alliance schism, where this alliance disaster, which was going through a 2.0 rulebook change, that is not the reason for this, it is completely Matt W, but was going over this 2.0 rulebook change, something that was kind of interesting, is now in complete limbo, because both are their own separate LARPs. And if you remember when I showed you the 5 chapters with the 3 incoming that are leaving, are naming it Refuge Larp, currently it's kind of pending, versus Alliance, so they will have to have different rule books, they'll have to be differing in certain ways, and it's just going to be a mess. This has happened a lot in LARPs, in our nation, in pretty much the world and everything else. There are a lot of LARP disasters like this, where there's a lot of schisms and where LARPs that could be bigger. Imagine if Alliance, which in about 19 years gained, 15 technical parks, really 10 with 3 incoming, joined up with Nero and all those other schisms. It could have been this major nationwide thing. We could make LARP something as big as tabletop games, or at least somewhat close, somewhat of a contender, but with all these schisms happening, this infighting, and making it so that we can't get any further, we're not able to ever reach that. That is why we are here, so that we can learn and not have history repeat ourselves. If you remember earlier on, when I talked about Nero, the founder, Mike V, left because of organizational issues, because there was a sole founder versus a chapter founder, and because they weren't able to influence that one person who owned the game. Thus, he took the terrible framework of what screwed him over in the last game and brought it into his new one. So how could he fix that, and how can you make sure that this doesn't happen to you and your LARP? The main thing that we need to learn is having a sole owner of a LARP. Having a sole owner is kind of like having a king. You might have a good king, which is fine, but you'll eventually have a bad king. Or you'll have a decent king who will lose interest because they're getting old and this is a hobby, and that's understandable. Either or, eventually something will go south. When something goes south like this, or if you get a terrible owner, it will destroy your game and much of the progress that you have built. It will destroy communities, it will make people who were friends fight and clash, and it'll just not be good for your LARP. So, the main thing that we can learn from this particular disaster is to make sure that sole ownership is not to a single person, or they can change rules arbitrarily, influence the LARP, and do all these terrible things. So that is the Alliance disaster in 2020. If you like this series about LARP disasters, then leave a like and comment below telling me that not only you like it, but what LARP disaster you would like to cover. Again, when speaking on Nero, there's 6 official schisms and a 7th one going on, so I could make a lot of videos on that. But there are many other LARPs that have had these issues. Too many. And we need to be able to make our LARPs actually stick together and eventually, maybe, one day, become as big and influential as something like tabletop games. Instead of just fragmented little parks here and there. Which is cool and fine, but we can be so much more. So until next time, keep LARPing.